Hello, night travelers. I am the Nightseer, and this is something darker still. Today's tale is the Hollow Feast. The gravel crunched under David's shoes as he walked up the winding path to the house, his boss's house, on Thanksgiving Day. It was one of the last places David would have chosen to be on any day, let alone today. But the invitation had come with the promise of an opportunity too good to ignore. A promotion, maybe even something better, worth enduring a few hours of stiff conversation, polite laughter, and the usual office politics dressed up in holiday cheer. The house loomed ahead, a 3-story colonial with dark, weathered siding. It didn't look like the sort of house David expected his boss to own. Wreaths adorned every window, but they weren't the cheerful kind. Their dried, brittle leaves curled like talons, and in place of berries, blackened gourds hung from their centers. In the yard, scarecrows dotted the patchy grass, their straw faces twisted into unsettling smirks, their arms stretched wide as if to embrace him. David frowned slightly at the strange look of the house, but shrugged it off, his eyes drifting back to his phone. It wasn't like he'd spent much time imagining where his boss lived anyway. He swallowed and adjusted his tie, his fingers fumbling for a moment before he stepped onto the porch and rapped on the heavy wooden door. It swung open immediately, startling him. A boy, no older than 10, stood in the doorway. Pale and slight, his stiff white button-up shirt and black slacks gave him the appearance of a miniature adult. His slicked-back hair and too formal clothing made him look like a scaled-down version of his father. "You're here," the boy said, his voice unnervingly flat, his wide, unblinking eyes locked onto David with an intensity that felt out of place for a child. "You're late." David frowned, glancing at his watch. "No, I'm right on time." The boy lifted his head just slightly, and his lips curled into the faintest hint of a smirk. "Time doesn't work the same here." Without another word, the boy turned and walked into the house, leaving the door open for David to follow. "Well, that's a shame," David muttered as he stepped inside. "I've got a very important flight to catch, so I'll have to keep a close eye on that." The air inside was thick and warm, carrying a strange blend of burnt sage and something sweeter, like molasses left too long on the stove. David followed the boy down a long, dimly lit hallway. The wood-paneled walls seemed to press inward, and the sound of their footsteps on the creaky floor was oddly muted. David barely glanced at his surroundings, keeping his focus on his phone. His boss's cryptic invitation echoed in his mind. "Tonight, everything changes. Dinner first. Then we'll discuss your future." Odd phrasing, but the prospect of a promotion was worth a little weirdness. David's flight to Bali was confirmed for 7:40 p.m., and it was already 4. As long as he left by 5:30 sharp, he could make it to the airport. Everything would work out perfectly as long as they stayed on schedule. He opened his itinerary again, checking it for the 5th time that hour. The dining room felt cramped despite the high ceilings, the long, narrow table stretching almost unnaturally across the space. At its center sat a chrome cloche, the kind usually polished to a mirror shine carried by a white-gloved waiter in a movie. There was no shine. The cloche caught the candlelight, its dull, cloudy silver surface etched with swirling lines, decorative at a glance. The pattern seemed oddly sharp in places. David barely noticed, dismissing it as a holiday excess. The boy gestured at the table. Sit wherever you'd like. Oh, I don't care where, David said absently, his attention on his phone. The boy didn't respond, instead pointing to a chair near the far end of the table. David sat, grateful to be left alone, and began scrolling through his phone. Next to the cloche sat a glossy glass jar etched with severe angular markings. Inside, a viscous black substance shimmered faintly, its surface rippling subtly in the candlelight. If David had looked closer, he might have noticed the strange scratches etched onto the table's surface as well, spirals that seemed to twist the wrong way. He might have seen the decorations, autumn leaves sharp enough to cut, brittle cornstalks that seemed to twitch and shiver in the draftless room. David's eyes flicked past the series of old gilded frames, not fully comprehending the paintings they held. To him, they were just scenery, and he was not interested. They registered as basic depictions of harvest scenes, nothing more. But that's not what they really were. In one painting, a group of farmers stood in a golden field, their scythes poised as if mid-harvest. But their faces were hollow and gaunt, their sunken eyes stared blankly ahead, their smiles stretched too wide, unnervingly fixed, and their hands gripped their tools with a stiffness that made them look like puppets. Another frame held a cornucopia at the center of a grand feast. But instead of fruit and grain spilling from its mouth, there were bones, long and brittle, some still flecked with dark stains. Around the cornucopia, the table was piled high with rotting food, the colors muted and sickly. The largest painting dominated the far wall. The scene it depicted was chaotic, almost feverish, its brushstrokes wild and frenzied, as though the artist had been overcome with madness while creating it. At its center was a table laden with an enormous turkey, its raw, pallid flesh slick with an unnatural sheen. Atop the long, narrow table stretched across the canvas, its surface littered with faintly glowing candles and strange, unrecognizable dishes. Around the table sat a group of figures, each draped in heavy cloaks that obscured their faces, their heads bowed slightly as though in prayer or submission. Standing behind each cloaked figure was another, taller form. These attendants were rigid and motionless, their faces blurred as though smeared by the artist's brush. Each held a large, dark jar in their hands, the vessels etched with faint, intricate symbols that seemed to shimmer faintly even in the painting. That's what David would have noticed. But David didn't notice. He checked his phone. 4:10. Dinner can't start soon enough. A middle-aged woman swept into the room next. She wore a fur coat despite the warmth of the house. her diamond earrings catching the dim light. She barely glanced at David before taking a seat near the head of the table. "Cheryl," she announced, her voice clipped. David nodded vaguely and returned to his phone. A second guest arrived minutes later, a wiry man with darting eyes, his clothes outdated by at least a decade, clung to him awkwardly. "Frank," he said, flashing a nervous smile. I assume we're all here for, well, you know." David raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Cheryl didn't even look up. The boy returned, now accompanied by the rest of the family. The mother, thin and pale, her fixed smile unnerving, and David's boss, the father, whose presence filled the room as he strode to the head of the table. "Welcome, everyone," the boss said, clapping his hands together. "I trust you're all comfortable. Dinner will be served shortly, but first..." The boy approached the cloche, his eyes flicking between the guests. He leaned toward Cheryl, whispering something in her ear. She recoiled, shaking her head with a faint grimace. He moved to Frank, whispering again. Frank paled and shook his head furiously. Finally, the boy stood before David and leaned in close. "Would you like to do the honors?" David's eyes drifted back to the cloche. What once seemed like harmless flowing patterns now felt distinctly wrong. The curves were too sharp, the lines unnervingly precise. He hadn't paid much attention earlier, but now he could swear the etchings were deeper, shifting. In the flickering light, the designs twisted unnaturally, almost as if they were alive. He shrugged it off. He didn't even consider it. No, thank you. I couldn't." He added a polite laugh for effect. The boy sighed dramatically and stepped to the cloche. "Fine, I'll do it." With a flourish, the boy removed the lid. Underneath was a turkey, a good-sized turkey, but it was raw and ugly, hastily plucked. Its pale skin glistened unnaturally, and a faint, sour smell wafted from it. The boy grinned, his teeth catching the light. "A gift for true pilgrims," he said reverently. The mother gave the boy a sharp glance, her serene smile faltering ever so slightly. It was the look of someone telling a child with their eyes to stop spoiling a surprise. No one else spoke. David shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing again at the unsettling turkey and the ominous jar. "Oh, something else we insist upon," the boss said, breaking the silence. His tone was as casual as if he were commenting on the weather, but there was a distinct edge to it. "It's our family tradition to enjoy dinner device-free. My son will come around with a basket. Please put your phone in it, and they'll be kept safely on the mantel." David stiffened, and from the corner of his eye he saw Cheryl bristle. She pressed her lips into a thin line, forcing a smile. "Oh, how quaint," she said, her tone dripping with thinly veiled frustration. Frank, on the other hand, leaned forward too eagerly. I love that idea," he said, his voice too loud, too enthusiastic. "You know, I was just thinking today I should be spending less time on my phone, so this is perfect, great tradition." He chuckled nervously, wiping his damp palms on his thighs. David glanced at the boy, who had already produced a woven basket and was making his way around the table. He lingered by Cheryl first, who hesitated before placing her phone inside with a huff. Frank handed his over without hesitation, smiling like he was about to get a gold star. David took his time, stalling as he fiddled with his phone. He pretended to swipe through a few notifications before finally dropping it into the basket with a sigh. The boy took it without a word and moved on. As the basket was carried away, David noted it wasn't placed on the mantel as promised, but instead carried through a side door and out of sight. His stomach tightened, but he forced himself to relax. It's fine. They're just trying to be old-fashioned or something. No big deal, he thought. He glanced at his smartphone. 4:15. All good. But then a notification flashed across the small screen. The abbreviated preview text read, "Urgent flight update." David's heart skipped a beat, but he didn't dare tap the screen to open the full message, not with his boss's eyes lingering on him. "David," his boss said, his voice smooth and commanding. "Tell me about this upcoming trip of yours." David froze, forcing a smile as his mind raced. "Oh, it's just a little getaway," he said, keeping his tone light. Doing a favor for friend and then some much-needed R&R. The boss's smile widened, his teeth just a little too perfect. "I see. Well, I hope you've left yourself enough time to truly enjoy this dinner first. After all," his eyes flickered briefly to the jar and his voice lowered ever so slightly, "we like to savor our traditions here." David settled back into his chair, forcing a polite smile as the boss took his seat at the head of the table. The boy returned without the basket and then disappeared into the kitchen, leaving the room momentarily quieter. "Well, David," the boss began, leaning forward with an unsettling air of familiarity. Tell us a little bit more about your trip." David straightened, clasping his hands in front of him. "Oh, right. It's kind of a combination thing." He started. His voice sounded thin, even to himself. "A wedding first, my best friend. Actually, I'm the best man. Then I tacked on a little time to explore Bali. Some hiking, beaches." The boss raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "A wedding?" David nodded quickly. "Yeah, my best friend's fiancé has always wanted to get married in Bali, so I figured, why not make the most of it?" He chuckled lightly, but his boss didn't join in. No one did. David continued, and for the first time his tone shifted. It was earnest, surprisingly, and instantly sincere. "I love the outdoors, the freedom, the openness. It's the one thing that really matters to me. This trip, it's a chance to finally take a much-needed break. A real one." Cheryl, seated near the head of the table, let out a sharp laugh. "Must be nice to just tack a vacation onto your responsibilities," she said, swirling her wine. "Not all of us can be so carefree, especially when there's work to be done." David bit back a reply, opting instead to glance at his watch. 4:55, still time. Just keep things light, he told himself. The mother re-entered carrying a steaming platter of bread and spreads, her serene smile in place as she set it down. The boy followed closely, cradling a pitcher of something dark and amber-like, its surface bubbling faintly. "Let us begin," the boss announced. He raised his hands and the family followed suit, their movements practiced, synchronized. The guest hesitated, but eventually mimicked them. David used the opportunity of his raised hands to check his watch again, the urgent flight notification still staring at him. The boss began the blessing, his voice steady and low. "Oh, provider, we thank you for the bounty only you can grant, for the harvest gathered by your grace and the favor that sustains us in your shadow, for the feast prepared in your honor and the offering that ensures your blessing. May we prove ourselves worthy of your gaze, and may you find satisfaction in what is given." The words lingered in the air like smoke, heavy and suffocating. They felt wrong. There was none of the warmth or familiarity of traditional Thanksgiving blessings, no mention of family or friends, no gratitude for love or connection. Every word seemed pointed, deliberate, aimed at something far beyond the room. David glanced at Cheryl and Frank. Cheryl had plastered on her polite smile, but her fingers tapped nervously against the stem of her wine glass. Frank's hand clenched the edge of his plate, his knuckles white. The turkey remained untouched, sitting raw and unappetizing under the flickering candlelight. The black jar beside it seemed to pulse faintly, like a heartbeat in time with the words of the blessing. The mother passed around the plates of appetizers, bread with strange, thick spreads that gleamed too brightly, felt too thick. A bowl of cranberries that looked plump and ripe, but burst with a sour smell when moved. David poked at his bread with a knife, noticing how it resisted the blade slightly, as though it weren't quite red. He pushed the plate aside, opting to reach for the drink instead. The murky liquid was thick, viscous, and left a faint, sweet, sour aftertaste that lingered unpleasantly. David coughed slightly, setting the glass back down. "Something wrong, David?" the boss asked, his tone light but his eyes sharp. No, David replied quickly. "Just different than I'm used to." The boss's smile widened. "Good, that's the idea." David's watch buzzed again on his wrist. The same notification. That was it. He had to know what was going on with his flight. "Excuse me," David said, pushing his chair back. "Could you point me to the restroom?" The boy appeared at his side almost instantly. "I'll take you." David followed him through the hallway and into the kitchen. The air here was hotter, heavier, and carried a faint smell of burnt sugar. If David had been paying attention, he might have noticed the oven. It was enormous, larger than any oven he'd ever seen. Its black metal surface carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shimmer. A low hum emanated from it, like something alive taking labored, rattling breaths. "Here," the boy said, gesturing to a small door. David stepped into the bathroom, locking the door behind him. He immediately tapped his smartwatch to open the airline notification. His stomach dropped. "Urgent flight update. Your flight has been moved to 7 p.m. David cursed under his breath. That shaved too many precious minutes off of his carefully timed plan. It was 4:57 now, and the dinner was only just starting. He splashed cold water on his face, trying to focus. The promotion, the flight, the wedding, his dream vacation in Bali. It was all crashing together, and he couldn't afford to lose any of it. Another notification popped up. "Have a great flight. See you when you land." It was from Alex, his best friend. David sighed heavily, but his stomach sank when a second text followed almost immediately. Please don't miss this. It would break Alex's heart. Please come through this time. This one was from Haley, Alex's fiancée. David rubbed his temples. Had he missed some of Alex's big moments in the past? Maybe once or twice, or fine, 7 times. But it wasn't on purpose. Things came up. Sometimes he didn't feel like going. Other times, it just wasn't worth the effort. But this time was different. He wouldn't miss this flight. Haley didn't know the real reason why. Alex had paid for David's ticket, every cent of it. The wedding? That was just the price of admission to get to Bali. Unnecessary inconvenience. It wasn't like David had lied. He would be there for the ceremony. He just wasn't planning to stick around long. He was a little miffed, honestly. The wedding fell during the last days of the annual buffalo races, a rare and breathtaking Balinese tradition he dreamed of witnessing for years. Ornate water buffalo teams racing to celebrate the rice harvest. He'd miss it now, of course. A shame. But he could live with that, knowing the week ahead was all his. 10 glorious days in Bali, beaches, mountains, the open sky. David had also insisted that Alex pay for David's hotel for the wedding, and David had in turn convinced Alex to add a few extra days to the stay. He'd earned this. After years of grinding at a thankless job, this trip was exactly what he needed. No deadlines, no obligations. Outside of the annoyance of the wedding, just him and the wild, unfettered freedom of nature. Both texts still lingered on his screen, but Haley's message stared back at him like an accusation. Please don't miss this, she said. Sister, I wouldn't miss this for the world, David muttered to himself, forcing a grin that didn't feel right even to him. He splashed his face again, trying to shake the weight of it all. David didn't notice, but the day outside flickered. For an instant, it wasn't sunlight spilling through the small window. The sky was black and the moon was hanging high and full, casting pale beams onto the ground below. David's watch glitched, and the numbers flashed erratically on various times before settling on 0000. He blinked as he dried his face, oblivious. The daylight snapped back, flooding the room again. His watch displayed 4:57 when he glanced at it. Faint voices drifted in from the dining room, drawing him back. David! The mother's voice cut through his thoughts, gentle, but with a sharp undertone of impatience. Are you all right in there? My husband is waiting. Coming, he said, forcing an overly polite voice as he opened the door. When David returned to the table, the family was in the middle of a round of thankfuls. The mother smiled, her expression serene but unnerving, as if joy were something that she rehearsed rather than felt. I am thankful for the provider's continued generosity, she began, her words slow and deliberate, for the life he grants us and the sustenance he ensures we will never lack. Her eyes lingered too long on the jar as she spoke. The boy was next, his voice sharp with excitement. I am thankful for the provider's blessings, for the strength he gives me, and for how he takes away what is rightfully his gaze snapped to David, unblinking as his lips curled into a small, unsettling grin. His teeth looked sharp in the light. The boss nodded approvingly and turned his gaze to Cheryl. Cheryl hesitated, gripping her wine glass like a lifeline. I'm thankful for... She forced a tight smile, her tone far too measured. For opportunities, for the chance to, well, rise above everything. Her eyes flickered to David and Frank, a glint of superiority flashing in them. I believe we all have a role to play, but some of us are just better suited for the top. She raised her glass in a mock toast, the corners of her mouth twitching in an almost sneer. The boss's expression didn't change as he turned to Frank, who shifted nervously in his seat. Frank cleared his throat, his fingers curling against the edge of the tablecloth. I'm thankful for this meal, for the company. He swallowed hard, his words picking up speed as though trying to outrun his discomfort. And for this chance, a chance to, finally get what I need, what I've earned. His chuckle was barely audible, a thin, nervous laugh that faded into silence. David shifted in his chair, uneasy as the attention turned to him. What was he supposed to say? What did they want to hear? He cleared his throat, stalling. I guess I'm thankful for things coming together. He began, his words carefully measured, his smile thin. He glanced at his boss briefly, then let his eyes drift to the table. Then habitually to his watch. At this angle, he couldn't see the exact time, but it started with a 5. And for timely things, for things staying on course and going as planned. He paused, his mind catching on the one thing that would truly matter to him, his trip to Bali, though he didn't say it out loud. The room was silent for a beat too long. David shifted again, suddenly self-conscious. Yeah, that's about it. The boss clasped his hands, startling David out of his spiraling thoughts. It's time for dessert, he declared, his voice unnervingly cheerful. David's heart raced. If he left by 5:40, he'd still make his flight. Anything after that, he'd have to speed, and even then, it would be close. 5:23. That pie smells delicious, the boss said, winking at the guests. Well, we'll just need a moment to prepare the rest of the festivities. Guests, please wait here. The family rose in unison, disappearing into the kitchen with unsettling efficiency. David felt Cheryl and Frank's eyes on him. Cheryl predictably broke the silence first. Well, she said, her voice cold and clipped. This charade has been enlightening. She looked between the two men, her lips curled into a sneer. Let's not waste any more time pretending. We all know why we're here, and it's not for the turkey. Frank shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the door as though someone might overhear. I need this, he muttered, his voice low but cracking with desperation. I've put in hours. The late nights, my kids, my wife, they've sacrificed for this, for me. I've earned it. Cheryl let out a sharp, humorless laugh. Sweetheart, the world doesn't work that way. She leaned forward, her gaze cutting into him. Your sacrifices don't mean a thing. The only thing that matters is results, and I deliver every time. Frank bristled, his face flushing red. David cleared his throat, drawing their attention. He wasn't used to being in the middle of an open conflict like this. "Wait, you two are here about the promotion?" "Of course," Cheryl snapped. "The fact that you didn't catch that shows you're not sharp enough for it, kid," Frank said. David's jaws tightened and he refused to take the bait. I know what I'm doing." Frank snorted. Cheryl rolled her eyes, swirling the wine in her glass. David's hands brushed against one of the table's deepest etchings as he reached for his drink, and he recoiled instinctively. The grooves were jagged and rough, as though carved with something far too sharp. It felt brittle, like running fingers over dried, splintered bone, and colder than the rest of the room, as though the etchings themselves carried a chill. The more David stared, the harder it was to look away. The dining room door creaked open, spilling shadows as the family emerged. Their attire echoed the austere simplicity of early colonial garments, but steeped in something far more menacing. Black doublets with exaggerated, jagged collars rose unnaturally high around their necks, the fabric stiff as though starched by ash and shadow. Their sleeves billowed like shrouds, tapering into cuffs adorned with dark, frayed stitchings that seemed to move faintly, as if alive. The garment's hems were jagged and singed, their edges dissolved into wisps of blackened thread that curled like smoke. Layered beneath the outer layers were thick, heavy robes, their coarse material etched with faint, ominous patterns, symbols that flickered in the candlelight as though carved over and over again by unseen hands. Their faces were obscured by bizarre masks, crude imitations of faces from a bygone age, their features warped into unsettling distortions. The masks didn't conceal their mouths. Instead, they framed them. The boy grinned, his small, sharp teeth catching and refracting the candlelight in a way that felt deliberate. Behind him, the mother clutched a bundle of dark cloaks, the fabric dense and heavy, absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. The father strode between them, his presence commanding, his lips curled into a smile as though pulled by unseen strings. The boy approached first, draping a cloak over Cheryl's shoulders. She stiffened, her lips parting in protest, but the boy's grin widened, daring her to object. She forced a tight smile. The mother followed, wrapping Frank in another cloak. He shifted uncomfortably, his hands twitching at his sides. Finally, they reached David. The father himself draped the cloak over him, its fabric heavier than it looked. It smelled faintly of ash and something sour. David tried to shrug it off, but his arms wouldn't move. The runes embroidered into the edges of the cloak seemed to shimmer faintly. The father returned to the table, carrying in the cloche with deliberate care. Its dull surface gleamed somehow darker under the flickering candlelight, but something about it had changed. What had once been an intricate pattern of harmless swirls and loops now seemed far more sinister, far more deliberate. David's eyes caught on the surface and his breath hitched. The lines weren't abstract anymore. They had twisted and coalesced into jagged shapes, too precise to be random. A face now leered at him from the side of the cloche. a long, gaunt visage with hollow eyes that seemed to glow faintly, catching the light in a way that made it seem alive. Its cracked, uneven teeth stretched into a grotesque grin. He blinked, hoping that the image would shift back into harmless abstraction, but it didn't. The face remained, its hollow gaze fixed on him, watching. The family moved with unsettling precision, their voices murmuring unintelligible as they brought the jar closer. As the father unscrewed the handle and fitted a gleaming funnel onto the cloche's now open top, the etched image shifted again. The twisted grin seemed to widen, the jagged lines of the teeth sharpening. Shadows danced across the surface, revealing more ghostly ghastly details. Below the face, a long, gnarled hand curled into a claw. The tips of its bony fingers dripped with what looked like black liquid. David's stomach turned. The claw wasn't just part of the design. It was moving. Its dark, viscous droplets seemed to shimmer and slide along the grooves of the etching. And there, at the base of the cloche, a new image had appeared. A cornucopia, its jagged mouth spilling forth not fruit or grain, but bones. Thin, brittle remains tumbled out in etched detail alongside rotting husks of food and shards of what looked like broken trinkets. The longer David stared, the more the image seemed to writhe, as if the cornucopia's contents were struggling to escape. The mother tipped the black jar, and its thick, tar-like fluid oozed into the funnel with an abnormal slowness, clinging to the metal as if reluctant to let go. The liquid pooled at the funnel's base and disappeared beneath the cloche. What is this? He whispered, his voice cracking. Preparation, the father said simply. A low, wet gurgle came from beneath the cloche, and the deep etching seemed to pulse and shimmer as though they were drawing life from the ritual. David tore his eyes away, but the image stayed with him, seared into his mind. He somehow knew with a grim certainty that whatever was happening beneath the cloche was wrong. The mother, son, and father each took a smaller jar, filled with the same black liquid. One by one, they approached the guest and stood behind them. The father intoned a series of low, guttural words that clawed at the guests' minds, sharp, like the edge of a migraine or the icy barb of a brain freeze. As the final syllable fell, the cloaks on their shoulders whipped upward, unnaturally, transforming into a full-bodied burlap sacks. They tightened with a vile precision, leaving only the guest's head exposed. Wide-eyed panic set in as the guests tried to protest, each in their own way, but their efforts were futile. The sacks seemed to hold a supernatural power, locking their bodies in place. Only their eyes remained free to move, darting frantically, as the rest of them remained immobilized, trapped by the eerie force of the constricting fabric. The mother stood behind Cheryl first, tipping her jar so that the thick fluid poured over Cheryl's head. It slid slowly, soaking into the cloak as Cheryl froze, her eyes wide. The father repeated the process with Frank, whose whimpers turned into muffled sobs. He closed his eyes. Finally, the boy approached David. The fluid poured over him, thick and heavy, like oil and tar combined. It smelled like honey. Sour honey? Sweet spoiled milk? It clung to his skin, cold at first, then warmer, then tingling. David tried to struggle, but the cloak held him firmly. The father carefully removed the funnel from the top of the cloche, tapped it so the excess ran inside. He methodically screwed the handle back on. Then, ceremoniously, he lifted the cloche, revealing the turkey. It had transformed, no longer just raw and unappetizing. It was bloated and grotesque, its bird flesh bubbling and oozing with the black liquid. Extra legs jutted out at impossible angles, and its head, now plural, twisted toward the guest with empty, hollow eyes. "We are preparing you for our provider," the father said. "You should be excited. You are about to meet Master Negrum, and you will look your very best," the child said. "He is our provider, and he is very hungry," the mother said. The deep etchings on the cloche distorted the reflections of Frank, Cheryl, and David, but that wasn't why they failed to recognize themselves. The black honey had done its work, and just as it had done on the turkeys, revealed something else, something truer, something monstrous. A low rumble echoed through the dining room, rattling the plates and glasses. David's eyes snapped toward the kitchen. At first, it was just a faint glow emanating from the oven, flickering like firelight. But then the glow intensified, spilling into the room with an eerie golden red hue that made the shadows on the walls stretch and twist unnaturally. The air thickened, oppressive and suffocating, carrying the acrid scent of burnt sugar mixed with something metallic, like scorched iron. The stove's metal face was no mere ornament then. The etched patterns, once harmless flourishes, began to ripple as the heat swelled, the lines twisting and warping as though alive. Slowly, they knitted together, forming a repulsive visage that loomed larger with every flicker of the fiery glow. Hollow eyes burned through the distortion, and an emerging gaping maw, jagged and impossibly deep, seems to stretch wider with each pulse of the heat. The metal groaned, a sound like ancient hinges under strain. David froze, his breath catching in his throat. This wasn't heat. This was something older, something that burned not with warmth, but with blistering, acrid malevolence. It seared the air, leaving a bitter metallic tang that scraped at the back of his throat. The growl grew louder, low, and guttural, vibrating through the room and rattling the tableware. The family remained still, their faces serene, reverent, as though this horrific display was nothing more than a quaint holiday ritual. The boy leaned forward, his voice a near whisper, laced with excitement. "He's coming." Then the growl stopped, replaced by a deafening creak. The oven door didn't open. It split apart hungrily, the metal stretching and tore like melting wax, fracturing to reveal a gaping void of swirling, ravenous light. This wasn't fire, it was hunger, raw and unrelenting, twisting and devouring the shadows around it. The light warped and curled unnaturally, throwing jagged silhouettes onto the walls as the room descended into chaos. Heat poured forth in waves, not just blistering, but suffocating, as though the very air had turned hostile. Just as Santa comes down chimneys, Nagram the unthankful comes through the cooking fire. These days, it's ovens, the boy exclaimed, his voice brimming with an unsettling excitement. And then the void birthed something. At first, it was only the suggestion of movement, wisps of shadow curling at the edges of the cavernous maw. Then the shapes coalesced, snapping into focus, small, wiry figures that scurried forward with unnatural speed. Their limbs were too long for their bodies, their movements jagged and insect-like, punctuated by faint bursts of ash and smoke as they flickered in and out of existence, vanishing from one spot and reappearing in another as if the space between had simply folded away. Their bodies were greasy and ashen, wreathed in smoke that dissipated and reformed with every movement. Dozens of them poured forth from the gaping maw of the oven, surging like a tide of living shadow. One of the creatures turned toward David. Its hollow eyes burned like coals, and its impossibly wide grin revealed jagged, shifting teeth that seemed to grow and shrink with each flicker of the void's light. The scrape of its claws on the floor was sharp and deliberate, like nails on a stone, a sound that burrowed into his mind. "True pilgrims," the boy said, his voice filled with pride. "They always come first." "Pilgrims aren't what we've reduced them to," the mother said, her voice soft but laced with menace. "The word has meaning, you know. These are the truest pilgrims, the ones who journey not for their own salvation, but to fulfill the will of the provider. They prepare the way for him, and they take what's needed without question." "Ah, they love it raw," the father said with a chuckle. "It's candy to them, keeps them obedient." As the pilgrims feasted, the father began to speak. "You see, our provider is not like others. He ensures that we are taken care of. But there is always a price, a harvest. And tonight, you are the harvest." The mother chimed in. "You each embody something the provider desires, something rare and delectable." The father adjusted his collar, his voice calm and pleasant as he spoke to the room. "Now, I know what you're all thinking. Why us? Why here? And let me assure you, there's no malice in this. I mean, don't get me wrong. You're not evil or anything. Heavens, no. There are much worse than you." He chuckled lightly, glancing at the mother and son as if sharing a private joke. "But a potato isn't evil either. Look how we treat those. Skin them, slice them, mash them. And turkeys, whew, we pluck them and stuff their hollow cavities with bread and herbs." He gestured toward the mutated turkey carcass on the table, now nothing more than scraps after the true pilgrims had finished. You get the picture, he continued, his tone growing more serious. You're the potato in this instance. The turkey, you see? You're right. Lovely ingredients and perfectly festive. So you'll do just fine, especially after you're prepared. As if timed purposely, the words hit their mark as the transformative work of the pouring of the sacred black honey continued. David tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat, or whatever part of him that was now. His arms and legs were immobile, the cloak now tightening around his body, the runes glowing brighter. Now, the father said, his voice dropping to a reverent tone, you'll all join Negrum at his eternal table, where he will feast on everything you are. Your greed, your selfishness, your indifference. You're the seasoning that makes you special. The air grew heavier as the runes on the cloaks flared to life. David watched in horror as Cheryl's cloak seemed to writhe like a living thing, encasing her body completely. She screamed, the sound muffled as the fabric closed over her face, transforming into a large sack. Frank's cloak followed, his protest dissolving into panicked sobs before he too was engulfed. David felt the cloak pulling at him now, constricting his movements further, his vision blurred as the edges of the sack began to creep up over his shoulders. The father stepped closer to the table, his voice calm, but weighted with dark finality. The hollow feast. It's a tradition as old as the provider himself. It lasts as long as you can endure it, and each of you has brought something unique for Negrum's table. Something undeniable. His gaze swept over the guests, pausing just long enough to make each one squirm in their own way. The mother's serene voice broke the silence. You're all so ripe with a certain absence. It's truly exquisite. Yes, the father agreed, his tone sharpening with the edge of delight. There is a void in you. It's the place where once gratitude might have taken root, but in its place, you've cultivated something far more flavorful. You're brimming with the succulent entitlement, overripe selfishness, delicious indifference. Such distinct notes, yet together a profile that promises to satisfy Negrum's every craving. The boy's eyes glinted as he turned to his mother. How will their preparations manifest, Mother? He asked, his voice eager and curious. The mother smiled, her gaze lingering on the guests as though savoring their discomfort. In whatever way they have earned, my dear, she said, her tone tender and motherly. The oven groaned, its fiery maw stretching even more impossibly wide, and from its depths came a hulking shadow that twisted the air around it. Negrum stepped forward. His towering form emerged into the room like a nightmare given substance. He's here, the boy whispered with elation. Negrum's frame was hulking and grotesque, a gaunt parody of life, as though famine itself had taken shape. Long, gnarled limbs extended unnaturally, their joints cracking as he moved, each step deliberate and predatory. His skin was a leathery patchwork of mottled fur, intermingled with weathered vines and rotting stalks, stretched tight over jutting bones that glinted like old weathered ivory. Beneath his hollow chest, a faint, sickly glow pulsed, an empty void where a heart might once have been. Now, a cavernous hunger that seemed to draw the air itself toward him. The creature's head was narrow and angular, its lupine snout stretching unnaturally long, tapering into a sharp, rigid beak that gleamed bone white. Yellowed, jagged teeth jutting from its mouth, too many to fit beneath the cracked, leathery lips that peeled back into a perpetual sneer. His eyes were worse, wide and predatory, glowing with a dim, sickly amber light that flickered like dying embers. Their pupils were slitted and sharp, darting with uncanny precision, as if seeing not just the room, but the very flaws within each soul present. Around his hunched shoulders hung a decayed, enormous cornucopia, its opening warped into a jagged, twisted maw. It spilled not plenty, but rot. Bones stripped clean, shards of broken trinkets, and food decayed beyond recognition. The cornucopia wept black honey, a viscous substance that dripped steadily onto the floor, pooling in slow, writhing puddles that seemed alive. From deep within its hollow depths came faint whispers and mournful groans, as though it carried the echoes of feigned gratitude long devoured. His arms stretched impossibly long, his skeletal fingers tipped with talons that glistened as though perpetually wet. The black fluid that dripped from them left searing marks on the tablecloth where it fell, an oozing corruption that seemed to pulse with malice. Rings of bone and rusted metal adorned his hands, each engraved with the symbols that shimmered faintly in the dim light. Shadows stretched and warped around him as though pulled by his presence, and the air in the room grew colder, the faint stench of decay and burnt sugar choking every breath. Negram's mouth moved, the sound of his voice low and guttural, like the groan of an ancient wood straining under weight. It was a strange sound that made the insides itch and the head ache. The father translated. Yes, Lord Negrum, thankfulness is fleeting, and hunger is eternal. The room trembled as he stepped closer, each talon clicking softly against the floor. The true pilgrims skittered at his feet like shadows given form, their hollow eyes turning to their provider with reverence. Negrum tilted his head, his glowing gaze locking onto the guests. You've ripened perfectly. Now it's time for Negrum to harvest his feast, the boy said with a grin. The true pilgrims swarmed the room, shifting in and out of shadows like wraiths, their jagged teeth gleaming as they dragged Cheryl's and Frank's sacks towards the gaping maw of the oven. Their movements were jagged, deliberate, as though savoring every moment of the harvest. David's sack tightened further, constricting his chest and arms until he could barely draw breath. He was dragged to the edge of the table, his body jerking against the pull. He barely twisted his head, straining to see his watch. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw his smartwatch going berserk. 6:06, then 7:06, then dozens of numbers flickered and blurred, slipping out of comprehension as the watch finally landed on 0000. For a moment, though, through the haze, David's mind drifted. He wasn't in the dining room anymore. He was on a mountainside. the air cool and clean, the sun cresting over distant peaks. He could almost feel the freedom in his chest, the weightlessness of being far from everything. The golden sands of the beaches stretching endlessly beneath him, the ocean's rhythmic crash a song of liberation. Bali. It was all so close, so painfully close. David's smartwatch buzzed again, pulling him from the memory. Through his blurring vision, he could make out the notification, now warped and jittery on the lock screen, though he could still barely make it out. It was from Alex. "Can't wait to see you. Pick you up at the airport when you land. Bali awaits." Below it, another message appeared, cold and final. "Your flight to Bali is now boarding." The father's voice pierced through the digital visual cacophony, calm and unbothered, as though the chaos were nothing more than a quaint after-dinner ritual. It carried an edge of amusement, like the punchline of a joke only the family understood. "So," the father intoned, "how about some dessert? It's always best after a proper feast." The last thing David saw through the small opening in the sack was the boy skipping past the oven, a perfectly cut slice of pie balanced on a delicate plate. The flames cast his sharp grin in stark relief, his teeth gleaming like polished bone. He winked, a mocking gesture that burned into David's mind as his world spiraled into blackness. The oven's maw groaned shut with a resonant finality, swallowing the room's heat and light. For David, Cheryl, and Frank, there was nothing left but blackness. Infinite, thankless blackness. Night travelers, and so ends the grim tale of the Hollow Feast. David, Cheryl, Frank, all consumed, not merely by the malevolent hunger of Negrum of the unthankful, but by their own appetites for recognition, for status, for selfish indulgence. Gratitude, such a small, fragile thing, and yet its absence can call forth horrors unimaginable. Perhaps, as you prepare for your own feasts, you'll pause to reflect on what you truly bring to the table. Are you brimming with thankfulness? Or might you too be ripening, unknowingly, for something darker still?